Brisbane has changed a lot over the past decade and it's still changing, which means moving here today can be a very different experience to what people remember or expect. The present and future reality of life in Brisbane may be quite different from what you think. I moved here in 2014 after living in places ranging from a small country town to Sydney and several large cities overseas. Since then, working on this channel has given me a pretty intimate view of how Greater Brisbane actually functions day to day. This video is mainly for people considering a move here, but if you already live in Brisbane, you might find yourself agreeing with some parts and disagreeing with others. And that's the thing, people's experience of living in Brisbane can be quite different. So we're going to unpack some of that complexity to help you work out whether Brisbane really is the right city for you. Because if we're honest, Brisbane can be a great city, but it's not for everyone. A quick side note before we get into it, because Brisbane is changing so fast, this video can only ever be a snapshot, and a lot can change between I'm thinking about it and I'm moving today. If you do decide to move here, or if you're in that research phase right now, I do weekly updates on what's happening across Greater Brisbane, plus deeper dives on specific topics like housing, transport, council decisions, major projects, and the things that can genuinely affect day-to-day life. So if you want to stay across what's happening right up to the time you actually arrive, and even stay up to date once you're already living here, that's exactly what this channel is for. Before we talk about climate, costs, transport, or anything else, we need to clear something up first, because when people say Brisbane, they don't always mean the same thing. Sometimes they mean the Brisbane City Council area. Other times they mean what's officially called Greater Brisbane, which includes Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Moreton Bay, and the Redlands. This video is about Greater Brisbane, not just the inner city. And that distinction matters because where you live within Greater Brisbane can completely change your experience, how much you pay for housing, how you get around, what services you have access to, and even how Brisbane feels day to day. You can live in Brisbane and still be 40 or 50 kilometres from the CBD. You can also live much closer in, but in an area that feels very suburban, very quiet, or very car dependent. That's why you'll often hear wildly different opinions about Brisbane. People aren't necessarily disagreeing, they're just talking about different versions of the city. And there's another reason those opinions can clash. Greater Brisbane is evolving quickly, and different parts of the region are changing at different speeds. Across Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Moreton Bay, and the Redlands, population growth has been strong, and that growth is driving new housing, new infrastructure, and gradual cultural shifts. Add in major projects in the lead up to the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, and the city is in a transition phase. In some ways, Brisbane is moving from what used to feel like a really big country town into a more complex city in its own right, and you can feel that in the pace of life, the development, and even the vibe in certain areas. So as you watch this, keep in mind, you're not just choosing Brisbane as it is today, you're choosing the direction it's heading. With that in mind, let's talk about one of the biggest factors shaping daily life here, the climate. When people are considering a move here, a common reason is the climate. It's one of the biggest factors that shapes how we live in Brisbane, and it's also one of the easiest things to misunderstand if you've only looked at averages on a chart. Brisbane has a subtropical climate. Winters are generally mild and dry, and summers are hot, humid, and wet. If you look at monthly averages, nothing there looks especially extreme. The average summer maximum in Brisbane City sits around 30 degrees, but averages don't reflect the extremes, and they don't tell you what it actually feels like to live here day to day. In summer, heat and humidity often combine in a way that can feel genuinely oppressive, especially if you're not used to it. It's not just about the daytime temperatures, which can push into the high 30s and occasionally close to 40. It's the lack of overnight relief, the stickiness, and the way heat can linger for days at a time. Some of the most common complaints among people living in Brisbane is the humidity, and for some people, the humidity is a genuine deal breaker. Another important thing to understand is that Greater Brisbane's climate isn't the same everywhere. Coastal and bayside areas often get more breeze and have slightly cooler nights. Western suburbs can feel noticeably hotter, particularly during the heat waves. While the average maximum temperature in January in Brisbane City is about 30 degrees, in Ipswich it's around 2 degrees hotter. And that's just the average. The extremes are often more pronounced the further west you go. Areas closer to rivers, creeks, or low-lying land can also experience weather impacts very differently during heavy rain. So when people talk about Brisbane weather, they're usually describing their part of Brisbane, not the whole picture. Heavy rain and storms are a normal part of life here, and in some areas that brings a real flood risk. Not all of Brisbane is flood-prone, but some areas are, and that risk isn't always obvious just by looking at a house or a street. This matters not just for safety, but for insurance. Two houses that look almost identical can have very different insurance premiums, simply because of flood modelling and historical data. In some suburbs, insurance costs can be a significant part of the overall cost of living, and it's something people don't always factor in early enough. The good news is that this isn't guesswork. There are publicly available flood mapping tools that let you check specific addresses for river flooding, creek flooding, and overland flow. If you're thinking about buying or renting, those tools are essential, and I'll link them in the description. One tip when using flood maps is not just to look at the risk for your home, but also the roads that lead in and out. During flood events, some people find themselves stranded when surrounded streets go underwater. Insurance is another area where it really pays to get quotes early, before you commit to a place, because the numbers can vary far more than people expect. Day-to-day life in Brisbane adapts to the climate. Air conditioning is often less of a luxury and more of a necessity. Outdoor activities tend to happen early in the morning or later in the afternoon during summer. And storms are part of the rhythm of life here, not rare events. On the other hand, winters are one of Brisbane's biggest strengths, mild, sunny, and very livable. For many people, that balance makes the summers worth it. So when people ask whether Brisbane is too hot or too risky, the honest answer is, it depends. It depends on what you're used to, where you live within Greater Brisbane, and how your home is built, as well as how well you understand the risks. The climate here isn't something to panic about, but it is something you need to understand properly before you move. For many people considering a move to Brisbane, housing is the single biggest factor, both in terms of cost and in terms of how difficult it can be to actually secure a place. Brisbane has changed a lot in this regard. It was once widely seen as a more affordable alternative to cities like Sydney and Melbourne, but that's no longer a reliable assumption. In recent years, housing costs here have risen sharply, and by several measures, Brisbane now sits among the most expensive cities in the country. House prices in Greater Brisbane are very high by national standards. At the time of making this video, Brisbane has the second highest median house price of any Australian capital, and the fewest properties priced under $500,000, according to recent analysis. In practical terms, that means buying into Brisbane, even well outside the inner city, often requires a level of income or borrowing capacity that surprises people relying on outdated perceptions of the market. Units and apartments can be more affordable than houses, but even there, prices have risen significantly, particularly in well-located or well-serviced areas. For renters, the situation is often even more confronting. Rents in Brisbane are among the most expensive in Australia, vacancy rates have been very low, and competition can be intense. It's not unusual for large numbers of people to apply for a single property, with limited room to negotiate on price or conditions. For those moving from regions with softer rental markets or from overseas, this can come as a real shock. Securing a rental here can take time, and it needs to be planned out carefully. For people unfamiliar with Brisbane's market, that complexity can make the whole process feel overwhelming, particularly if you're trying to organise things from interstate or overseas. As with almost everything in Brisbane, housing costs vary enormously depending on where you live. Inner and middle ring suburbs tend to be the most expensive and most competitive. Further out, prices can be lower, but that usually comes with trade-offs, such as longer commute times, fewer transport options, and in some cases, higher insurance or infrastructure-related costs. It can help to think about Brisbane's cost of living as more than just rent or a mortgage. Insurance can vary a lot, not just for flood and storm risk, but also things like theft risk. Electricity bills can be higher than people expect, especially with air conditioning in summer. Transport costs add up too: fuel, tolls, and parking if you're commuting. And even basics like internet quality can vary more than people realize. NBN speeds and reliability can differ street to street, which matters a lot if you work or study from home. If you want a deeper look at how council rates differ across Greater Brisbane and what each council actually spends that money on, I've done a dedicated video on that, and I'll link it in the video description along with some other really helpful videos. One partial offset to all of those costs is that public transport fares are capped at 50 cents per journey, which can help when other costs start stacking up. But as we'll explore later in this video, just how viable it is to rely on public transport varies dramatically depending on where you live and where you need to get to. It's also important to look at housing costs alongside income. While Brisbane has strong employment opportunities in many sectors, wages in some industries are lower than in Sydney or Melbourne. So even where housing prices look similar on paper, affordability can actually be tighter depending on your line of work. That's why it's not enough to ask whether Brisbane is cheaper. The more useful question is whether it's affordable for you given your income, lifestyle, and expectations. The reality is that Brisbane no longer offers universally affordable housing. What it offers instead is variation and choice if you're willing to accept the trade-offs. Space versus location, commute time versus housing cost, insurance risk versus purchase price, convenience versus lifestyle. None of those choices are clearly right or wrong, but they do require clear-eyed planning. Brisbane can still work well financially for some people, but it's no longer the automatic, cheaper option it once was. And because the city's still growing quickly, the areas that feel affordable or up and coming can change quickly over just a few years. Another thing you'll sometimes notice if you start researching Brisbane online is frustration from some locals about population growth. Over the past few years, a lot of people have moved here from interstate, and with housing costs rising quickly, that's become a sensitive topic. You'll occasionally see comments saying things like, "We're full," or "Don't move here." Most of the time, that sentiment isn't really about individual people moving here. It reflects broader concerns about housing affordability and how quickly the city has changed. In reality, population growth is only one part of a much bigger housing picture that includes planning decisions, construction rates, infrastructure, and the broader economy. But it's helpful to understand that this conversation exists because it's part of the current moment that Brisbane is going through. All of this means that buying property in Brisbane today can be quite complex, especially if you're trying to navigate the market from interstate or overseas. That's where some people choose to work with a buyer's agent. This video is supported by Home Scouts, a local buyer's agency that works exclusively for buyers, not sellers, representing your interests throughout the purchase process. They help interstate and overseas buyers, as well as busy professionals, by attending inspections, negotiating with agents, and even bidding at auction on your behalf. Home Scouts are accredited by Australia's peak buyers agency bodies REBA and PIPA, and can run active searches across both Greater Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. Click this QR code or the link in the description if you'd like to learn more. And once you start weighing up the costs, the next obvious question is income. What work is available here, and how easy is it actually to earn a living in Brisbane? Employment is the other half of the equation when it comes to deciding whether Brisbane is viable for you long term. The short version is that Brisbane does have a strong and diverse job market, but how well it works for you depends heavily on your industry, your experience level, and what you expect to earn. Greater Brisbane has seen strong employment growth over recent years, driven by population growth, infrastructure spending, and major projects leading up to the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Large employers include government, health, education, construction, professional services, logistics, and increasingly technology and knowledge-based industries. There's also a steady demand for trades and essential services, particularly as the city continues to expand outward. That said, a strong job market doesn't automatically mean an easy one. For many roles, particularly professional and white-collar positions, competition can be intense. Brisbane attracts a lot of interstate and overseas migrants, many with solid experience, which can put pressure on job seekers, especially for entry and mid-level roles. People moving from smaller cities or regional areas are often surprised by how competitive the Brisbane job market can be, even when unemployment is relatively low. One of the biggest adjustments for some people is the relationship between wages and housing costs. While salaries in Brisbane are competitive in certain sectors, wages in many industries are still lower than Sydney or Melbourne. That wasn't always a major issue when housing here was much cheaper, but with housing costs now very high, that gap matters more. This is where affordability can become tight. Two people earning the same income may have very different experiences depending on whether they bought years ago, are renting now, or are trying to enter the housing market today. In general, Brisbane tends to work best for people who already have secure employment lined up, work in sectors with strong local demand, can work remotely or bring income with them, or have made a conscious decision to trade off salary for lifestyle. It can be more challenging for people arriving without a job, relying on short-term or casual work, or assuming they'll figure it out once they arrive. For some people, lower wages are offset by lifestyle factors, shorter commutes than Sydney, easier access to outdoor activities, or a different pace of life. For others, especially if housing costs stretch their budget, the trade-off doesn't stack up quite so well. There's no simple right answer here, but it's important to be honest with yourself about what's really important to you. If you're considering a move to Brisbane, employment planning is essential. Having work lined up before you move, understanding typical salaries in your field, and being realistic about competition can make the difference between a smooth transition and a very stressful one. Brisbane can be a great place to work, but it rewards preparation more than optimism. And for many people, employment decisions are tied closely to education, either for themselves or for their kids. So next, let's talk about study, schools, and universities in Greater Brisbane. Education costs and access in Brisbane vary a lot by school sector, where you live, and in some cases visa status. For Australian citizens and permanent residents, Queensland's public school system is generally free to attend. That said, free doesn't mean cost-free. Even though public schools don't charge tuition fees, families still need to budget for things like uniforms, books, devices, excursions, and school contributions. As a very rough guide, that can be around $500 to $1,500 a year in primary school and often over $1,000 a year, sometimes a fair bit more, in secondary school, depending on the school. Another concept that's important, and sometimes unfamiliar to overseas viewers, is school catchments. Most public schools have a defined catchment area, which means priority enrollment is given to students who live within a specific geographic boundary. And if you live inside the catchment, your child is usually entitled to attend that school. If you live outside it, acceptance isn't guaranteed. This matters because schools with strong reputations can drive housing demand within their catchments, pushing up prices and rents in those areas. In some parts of Brisbane, where you live can effectively determine which public schools you can access. Greater Brisbane also has many private and independent schools, including Catholic, Anglican, and other independent schools. Fees vary widely. Some schools charge a few $1,000s per year, while others can run into the tens of thousands, particularly at the secondary level. On top of fees, there are often additional costs for uniforms, devices, camps, and activities. Places at well-known private schools can be competitive, and waiting lists are common, sometimes starting years in advance. So for families considering private schooling, early research and early inquiries are really important. It's also useful to look at education costs over the long term. Based on national research that estimates total schooling costs over a full 13-year education, Brisbane generally sits lower than Sydney for private schooling, but higher for Catholic schooling, with public schooling costs broadly similar across capitals once extras are included. Those aren't exact fees, but they give a sense of how costs can add up over time and why planning matters just as much as the choice of school system. For families on temporary visas, the situation can be different again. In many cases, temporary residents are required to pay school fees to attend public schools, and those fees can be significant. For some families, private schooling becomes a comparable or preferred option, but again, fees vary widely and places can be competitive. If you're moving to Brisbane on a temporary visa with school-aged children, it's really important to check eligibility, fees, and enrolment timelines early, because assumptions based on the public system don't always apply. Brisbane is also a major tertiary education hub, with several large universities as well as TAFE and vocational education providers. For Australian citizens and permanent residents, university fees are typically subsidised, often through the HECS Help system. For international students, fees are much higher and paid upfront, which can make the cost of study a major financial consideration. For students, particularly international students, living costs can be just as important as tuition fees. Rent near universities or along good public transport corridors can be expensive and competitive. While public transport fares are capped at 50 cents per journey, commute times and service availability are still important considerations when choosing where to live. One thing worth saying is that there's no single best education pathway in Brisbane. There are excellent public schools, strong private schools, and well-regarded universities, but experiences vary widely depending on the institution, location, and individual needs. As with housing, what works well for one family or student may not work for another. If education is a key reason for your move, early research is essential. Understanding visa status, school catchments, fees, and day-to-day logistics can make a big difference, not just to costs, but to how smoothly life works once you're here. And of course, education doesn't exist in isolation. For many people, especially families, decisions about schools, study, and work are closely tied to another set of very practical questions: healthcare, childcare, and how easy it actually is to access the services you need once you're living here. So let's talk about that. Healthcare and childcare don't always get as much attention as housing or work when people are planning a move, but once you're living here, they can have a big impact on day-to-day life. Starting with healthcare. Australia's public healthcare system provides access for citizens and permanent residents, and Brisbane has a large network of public and private hospitals, specialists, and primary care providers. Exactly what you're covered for depends on your residency or visa status. For most people, the overall standard of care is high, but access, cost, and wait times can vary depending on where you live and what services you need. One thing newcomers often notice is that while emergency care is generally prompt, non-urgent appointments can involve long waits. Many GP visits now involve some out-of-pocket cost, even for Australian residents, and finding a regular doctor who is taking new patients can take time in some areas. For specialist care, public wait lists can be long, while private care usually means faster access but much higher costs. As with many things in Brisbane, healthcare access isn't evenly distributed. Inner and middle ring suburbs tend to have more options close by, while outer growth areas can lag behind population growth. It's worth checking not just where the nearest hospital is, but how easy it is to book appointments with local GPs, dentists, and allied health providers. For people moving on temporary visas, healthcare works differently again. Access depends on visa conditions, reciprocal healthcare agreements, and private health insurance. For many temporary residents, comprehensive private health cover isn't optional, it's essential, and that becomes another ongoing cost to factor into your budget. Childcare is another area where planning really matters. Greater Brisbane has a large childcare sector, including long day care, family daycare, and kindergartens, but availability can be tight, particularly in fast-growing suburbs. Waiting lists are common, and in some areas, parents put their names down well before they actually need a place. Costs can also be significant. While government subsidies help many families, out-of-pocket costs still vary widely depending on the type of care, hours required, and eligibility. As with schools, where you live can make a real difference, not just to cost, but to availability and convenience. One thing that often catches people out is how childcare, work, and daily travel all intersect. A centre that looks close on a map isn't always practical if it's in the opposite direction to your commute, or if traffic makes drop-off and pick-up stressful. The broader point here is that healthcare and childcare in Brisbane generally work well, but they reward planning. Knowing what you're eligible for, understanding likely costs, and checking local availability early can make a big difference to how settled you feel once you arrive. And once you start thinking about things like schools, doctors, childcare, and work, another question quickly follows. How easy is it to actually get to where you need to go each day? Because in a city as spread out as Greater Brisbane, transport can shape your routine just as much as where you live. So let's talk about getting around. How easy Brisbane is to get around depends very heavily on where you live, where you work, and how you expect to travel. This is another area where expectations don't always line up with reality, particularly for people arriving from cities with more comprehensive public transport coverage. For most people living in Greater Brisbane, the car is still the primary way of getting around. The region is geographically spread out. Many suburbs are low density, and daily trips often involve distances that make walking or cycling impractical. For families in particular, owning at least one car is often a necessity rather than a choice. One statistic that helps explain this comes from research by the Climate Council, which found that only about a third of people in Greater Brisbane have access to reliable, frequent public transport. It means access is very uneven. Some areas are well served with frequent services and direct routes. Others have limited coverage, infrequent services, or require multiple connections to get anywhere. This is one of the biggest reasons people's experiences of Brisbane transport differ so much. And there's another Brisbane-specific factor that shapes travel: the river. The Brisbane River is a huge part of what makes the city beautiful, but it also shapes how the city connects. Sometimes a trip that looks close on a map isn't close in travel time because the practical crossing points matter. That's one reason it's worth testing real-world trips before you commit to a suburb, especially if your work, school, or family life is on the other side of the river from where you're looking. Brisbane's public transport network includes buses, trains, and ferries, and recent fare changes mean most TransLink trips are currently a flat 50 cents. That's a major cost saving, but affordability and usability aren't the same thing. If you live near a rail line, a busway, or a high-frequency corridor, public transport can work very well, particularly for CBD-focused travel. But if you live further out, work irregular hours, or need to travel across the city rather than into it, public transport can be slow, indirect, or simply not viable. One part of Brisbane's transport network that really is distinctive is the ferry system. CityCat and ferry services play a key role in moving people along the river, and for some trips they're not just convenient but genuinely faster and more pleasant than road or rail options. They also connect parts of the city that aren't well linked by other modes. That said, ferries are inherently limited to river-adjacent suburbs, so while they're a major asset, they're not something everyone can rely on. Active transport, walking, cycling, and using e-mobility devices like e-scooters, has been growing steadily in Brisbane, supported by gradual improvements in infrastructure such as bikeways, shared paths, river walks, and inner-city connections. There are a number of providers that hire out e-bikes and e-scooters, and these are becoming a common sight in Brisbane, particularly close to the inner city. For people living in inner suburbs, near the river, or close to major activity centres, active travel can be a practical and time-competitive way to get around. However, distance, heat, humidity, and gaps in the network still limit how viable active transport is for many people, especially in outer suburbs or during summer. There have been genuine efforts to improve public transport in recent years, including the rollout of Brisbane's new metro bus services. One thing worth clarifying for newcomers is that when people in Brisbane talk about the metro, they're not talking about an underground rail system. It's a high-capacity, high-frequency bus system running along dedicated corridors, and it's been introduced in stages alongside changes to the broader bus network. Looking forward, the other major change to Brisbane's transport network is the Cross River Rail. The Cross River Rail is a new rail line currently under construction, including twin tunnels under the Brisbane River and CBD, and new underground stations at Boggo Road, Woolloongabba, Albert Street and Roma Street, plus other station upgrades and works across the network. The idea is to increase capacity and improve the way the rail network moves through the city centre, which matters a lot as Greater Brisbane continues to grow. It's also worth knowing that while these big projects can improve capacity and reliability over time, the short-term reality during construction can involve disruptions, detours, and changed travel patterns, which is another reason it pays to test your commute and keep up with what's changing. Because so many people rely on cars, fuel costs matter a lot here. Brisbane has had some of the most expensive fuel prices out of any Australian capital in recent years, and our fuel price cycles can be volatile. Pricing can jump quickly and stay high for longer than people expect, especially if you're not familiar with how the cycle works. Many locals use apps like Petrol Spy to track prices and find cheaper fuel, because where and when you fill up can make a real difference over time. When thinking about transport in Brisbane, it's not enough to ask whether the city has buses, trains and ferries. The more useful question is how you would actually get from where you live to where you need to go, at the times you need to travel, and how often you'd realistically be willing to do that. Mapping real-world trips, checking service frequency and factoring in fuel costs before you move can save a lot of frustration later. And once you've thought about housing, work, education, and how you get around, the next question many people ask is about safety. So let's talk about crime and how to check it properly. Crime and safety are things people understandably want to understand before moving anywhere, and Brisbane is no exception. As with many topics in this video, the reality sits somewhere between extremes, and experiences can vary a lot depending on where you live, how you live, and what kind of crime you're talking about. Overall, Brisbane is not an unusually dangerous city by Australian standards. Violent crime rates are generally lower than in many comparable international cities, and for most people, day-to-day life here feels safe. That said, Brisbane does experience property crime, and in some areas, that's the issue people are most likely to encounter. For many residents, concerns around crime tend to be less about personal safety and more about things like car theft, break-ins, and theft from vehicles. Those types of crime are not evenly distributed. Some suburbs experience far higher rates than others, and even within the same suburb, experiences can differ street by street. This is one reason you'll hear very different opinions about crime in Brisbane. Someone living in a well-connected inner suburb or a quiet outer area may feel very safe and rarely think about crime at all. Someone else in a different part of the city might have a very different experience. It's not that one person is right and the other is wrong, they're often talking about different places. But if you're not from here, how can you know where rates are higher and where they're lower? One of the most important things you can do if you're considering a move is to look at the actual data, rather than relying on anecdotes or social media posts. Queensland Police provide a public online crime map that lets you explore reported crime by suburb and by offence type and see how patterns change over time. It's a really useful tool for understanding local context rather than broad headlines. When using tools like this, it's important to look at trends over time, not just a single snapshot, and to distinguish between different types of crime. For most people living in Brisbane, everyday safety comes down to fairly ordinary precautions. Locking cars and homes, being aware of your surroundings, and understanding your local area go a long way. Many people live here for years without ever being directly affected by crime. At the same time, it's reasonable to factor crime into housing decisions, particularly if you're choosing between suburbs or even between streets. One thing that people don't always realize is that an area's crime history can also influence insurance premiums. Insurers look at a range of risk factors, and in some cases, higher rates of theft or break ins can contribute to higher premiums or excesses. It's not the only factor, but it's another reason why checking local crime data can have financial implications, not just peace of mind ones. So the question isn't really, is Brisbane safe? A better question is, how safe is the specific area I'm looking at, and how does that line up with my comfort level, lifestyle, and budget? Brisbane isn't risk-free. No city is. But with a bit of research and context, most people are able to find areas they feel comfortable and secure in. And once you've weighed up the practical realities, housing, work, education, transport, and safety, what's left is the day-to-day experience of living here. So let's talk about lifestyle and what life in Brisbane actually feels like. Lifestyle is one of the main reasons people consider moving to Brisbane, but it's also one of the hardest things to describe accurately. That's because Brisbane doesn't have a single uniform lifestyle. How it feels to live here depends a lot on where you live, how you work, and what you value day to day. Brisbane is a city that lives outdoors. The climate encourages it, and so does the way the city is laid out. Parks are everywhere. Brisbane City alone has more than 2,000 of them, along with riverside paths, outdoor dining, weekend markets, and very casual socialising. Add to that the national parks throughout Greater Brisbane and the surrounding region, with hiking tracks, waterfalls, and camping areas, and access to the outdoors becomes a normal part of everyday life. For people who enjoy being outside, Brisbane can feel very easy to live in, especially during the long stretch of mild weather during autumn, winter, and spring. One thing locals often point out, and for good reason, is Brisbane's proximity to both the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. For many people, both are close enough for regular day trips or weekends away, and for some, even commuting. That said, it's worth being clear about what that does and doesn't mean. Brisbane isn't a beach city in the way places like Sydney or the Gold Coast are. You generally can't duck out for a surf before or after work on a weekday. The coast is accessible, but it's not on your doorstep. For some people, that's a minor trade-off. For others, especially those who want the ocean as part of daily life, it can be a significant lifestyle difference. One thing that often surprises people is the rhythm of daily life in Brisbane. Days tend to start earlier and wind down earlier than in cities like Sydney or Melbourne. Cafes open early, mornings are busy, and evenings are generally quieter, particularly outside the inner city. Newcomers are often surprised to find cafes closing around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, and restaurant kitchens shutting as early as 8. That suits some people very well. Others find it takes some adjustment. I've been here for over 10 years, and I still often find myself wishing I could grab a cappuccino at 5 or 6 in the evening. On the other hand, plenty of locals love the fact that they don't have to search far for a 6 a.m. latte. Queensland doesn't observe daylight saving, and Brisbane is no exception. That's a positive for some people, including me, and a negative for others. In summer, it means earlier sunrises and earlier sunsets. It's one of those things that sounds minor but can genuinely affect how you use your time, especially if you're used to longer evenings elsewhere. Brisbane is a diverse city, but it tends to express that diversity in a quieter way. There's a wide range of food, cultures, and communities across Greater Brisbane, but the city doesn't have the same density or intensity you might associate with larger global cities. For some people, that feels relaxed and accessible. For others, it can feel spread out or limited. There's plenty to do here: arts, music, sport, festivals, dining, but it's not all concentrated in one place. You often need to travel to access different experiences, and spontaneous late-night options are far more limited than in some other capitals. Again, whether that's a positive or a negative depends on what you're looking for. Brisbane tends to reward a bit of planning. It's not a city where everything is 5 minutes away. For many people, Brisbane's lifestyle works because of the balance it offers. It can feel less pressured than larger cities with easier access to nature and a more relaxed pace. But that comes with trade-offs: fewer late-night options, longer distances between places, and a city that still relies heavily on cars. This is where Brisbane tends to suit people who value balance over intensity. Brisbane isn't a city that tries to impress you every day. It's a place that tends to work best for people who enjoy routine, value space and time, and are comfortable trading some convenience and variety for lifestyle and livability. For the right person, that's exactly what makes it appealing. And that leads to the last and probably most important question. What kind of people does Brisbane suit, and who might struggle here? For all the detail we've covered, housing, work, education, transport, safety, lifestyle, this really comes down to one question. Is Brisbane the right fit for you? Because Brisbane isn't a city that works equally well for everyone. If you like having space, access to the outdoors, and a relatively relaxed pace of life, Brisbane can feel very livable. It tends to suit people who are comfortable planning ahead, who don't need everything on their doorstep, and who are okay trading some convenience and variety for time, space, and work-life balance. It can also work well for people at a stage of life where routine matters, families, people settling into longer-term work, or anyone looking for a city that feels less pressured day to day. Where people often struggle is when expectations don't line up with reality. If you're looking for late-night energy every day of the week, dense neighbourhoods where everything is walkable, or beaches as part of daily life, Brisbane may feel limiting. And if you expect public transport to work everywhere or assume the cost of living will automatically be lower than other capitals, that can lead to frustration as well. One of the reasons opinions about Brisbane vary so widely is that people are often comparing very different versions of the place. Where you live, where you work, how you get around, and what you prioritize all shape your experience. Two people can live in Brisbane and have lives that feel completely different. After living in a range of places, mostly larger, busier cities, Brisbane took me some time to adjust to. If I'm honest, I didn't enjoy living here at first, but once I made an effort to get to know the city more deeply, to let go of some expectations, and to focus on what Brisbane actually offers rather than what it isn't, it grew on me. Do I still miss some of the conveniences of larger cities? Absolutely, but I can genuinely say I'm happy living here now. And I also know there will be people for whom Brisbane will never feel like the right fit, and that's okay. So the most useful question isn't, is Brisbane a good city? It's, is Brisbane the right city for me right now, given how I live and what I want next? If you go into a move with clear expectations, an understanding of the trade-offs, and a sense of what you're gaining as well as what you're giving up, Brisbane can be a great place to build a life. And if it's not the right fit, that's not a failure, it's just education. Hopefully this video has helped you see Brisbane a little more clearly, not as a headline or a stereotype, but as a place with real strengths, real challenges, and very different experiences depending on how you live. If you're still in the early stages of planning a move, the team at Home Scouts have put together a free Moving to Brisbane checklist that walks you through things like suburb research, inspections, and what to prepare before settlement. I've linked that in the description below if you'd like to download it. If you're thinking about a move, take your time, do your research, and be honest with yourself about what matters most. That's the best way to work out whether Brisbane is where you belong. And if you want to keep across what's changing in Greater Brisbane right up to the time you move, and even once you're living here, here's the latest weekly update video. Even locals love the way the updates keep them in the loop. See ya.